Hi, and welcome. I'm really excited to have you all join me today. Um, Before we get started, I will ask if folks are game, and I'm mindful if you're having lunch or breakfast right now, totally understand. But if you're game to turn your camera on, that just helps me as a facilitator make sure that I am not going too fast, that folks are keeping up with me, that I'm making sense, all those good things. So it's really nice to be able to engage with faces if that's possible. But we'll go ahead and get started. Justin, I just saw you log on. Welcome. Good morning, or rather, good afternoon. I know you're out here in Boston. Um, cool. So let's go ahead and get started. I think we've got a lot of ground to cover today. Really excited to have all of you here on the call with me. The goal of today's conversation is to talk about the idea of stability planning in a nonprofit context. For those of us that are living in this sector and perhaps this country right now, we recognize that things are a little less stable, more ambiguous, more uncertain than I think many of us would probably like. And that is a tough context to plan in. I'm doing some strategic planning work with a client now where it feels a little laughable to try and strategic plan when there's so much that's unknown. And so the goal of today is to give us an option for thinking about planning that focuses more on how we create stability. And so that's what we're going to do today. Just to start, I'll say my name is Julia. I work as an organizational development and strategy practitioner supporting the nonprofit sector. I'm based out of just north of Boston, Massachusetts in Salem. And my work is really about how we center the human experience in organizational systems. And I do that through different kinds of organizational transformation and participatory strategy work. This is the first in what I'm hoping is going to be a series of public webinars that I do around different topics that are topical and timely for the sector. And so I will acknowledge that I am a little nervous because I've kind of never done this before. And so I'm really excited to have you here with me. I am going to be circulating a feedback survey at the end because I would love your feedback, both on today's workshop, but also if there are other topics like this that would feel helpful to have somebody talk about. And so I'll circulate that at the end. So that's me. What we're here to do today is to, like I said, offer an alternative to how we think about planning that is more oriented around how we create stability. We're in such an ambiguous, such an uncertain time. I know a lot of the organizations that I'm working with right now are really struggling to find firm footing for their clients, for their constituents, for their staff. And so if you find yourself in that kind of situation, planning with an eye towards stability might be something that gives you some breathing room, some grace, some space to kind of move and focus, even as things around us feel really uncertain. And so I'm going to walk through that process today. We're going to talk about what this means in contrast to other kinds of planning, like strategic planning, what areas we can focus on in a stability planning context. And I'm hoping to walk you through in a really practical way what it would look like to lead this process in your own organization. Ordinarily, when I do sessions like this, I do try and have them be really participatory, where we work with a case study or a scenario. But I do have a lot of content that I want to make sure I share with you today. And so while I do hope this feels like a dialogue and you're able to jump in and ask questions and provide feedback, we won't be doing any scenario-based work today. I will be sending the slides in an email after this session. And for those of you that might want them, I am also going to drop them in the chat now. So if you're someone who likes to have that to follow along, you'll find them in the chat. And what I wanted to acknowledge too is that in this moment where things feel really hard, what I'm hoping to offer you isn't a magic bullet. It's hopefully just a new way of thinking about planning that might give you some insight or some direction. And it's rooted in the idea that while I don't have the answers to your problems, I will bet money on the fact that your staff do. And so for me, participatory processes are really a way to surface the things that are already inside your organization that help you solve big problems, that help you grapple with big challenges. And so that's kind of the spirit of today's conversation. So before we dive in, just so that we can all maybe get our voices into the room and connect a little bit, I'd love to ask if we could share either in the chat or feel free to open your mic or a pretty small group to share a little bit about what stability enables. What does it enable for us as people? What does it enable for us as organizations? What does stability let us do?
It lets us know what to expect.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And can be comforting.
Yeah. Other side of that is reducing stress, I think, Melissa. Thank you. The ability to dream more expansively. I love that, Emma, because I think for a lot of people, stability feels kind of lame. As nonprofits, we love to dream big and imagine what's possible, and stability doesn't always feel that exciting. But that's what creates the conditions for us to dream big. Helps us to be actively creative. If we're too unstable, we'll get more risk averse. Absolutely. Take new risks on strategies or programs. Build confidence in growth recommendations. Experiment with new ideas. It brings us comfort. Yes, I think all of these really resonate for me. So there are often a lot of ways that we can create stability. It's a little harder to do when there's more happening outside of our control that disrupts stability. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Collaborate effectively. Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot that building stability can create for us as people, can create for us as nonprofits, can help us do in service of the missions that we seek to drive every day. And so that's what I'm hoping today's conversation can center around. How do we create that stable foundation so that we can do all of these great things? So before we dive into the process, I wanted to start a little bit talking about planning and why we plan. And there's no trick question here, but I'm curious for those of you in the room, why do we plan? What do we look to get out of a planning process? Why do we put all this time and effort into planning?
To feel like we have a sense of control.
Absolutely. My type A self loves planning. Absolutely. Yeah, real Emma, thank you. Why else do we plan? Keep the team moving in the same direction, attack investments, use our time and resources efficiently, acting with intent and alignment. Oh, attract. Yes, that makes more sense than attack. Attract investments. Anything else? What do we get out of a planning process? So what I'll offer is, in my mind, there are 4 big buckets of things that we get out of planning, and I think they kind of go in order. So I think the first is we create alignment. We help create a shared sense among a group of people, what's important, why is it important, what are our goals, what roles do we each play in achieving those goals. And I'll say that I think that's one of the hardest things to do in this process, is to create that alignment. For any of you who are managing teams, creating that alignment is no easy thing. I'm seeing some nodding here. So first, I think it helps us create alignment. That alignment then helps create clarity in making choices. What will we do? What won't we do? I think the what won't we do part is probably the most important, knowing what are we saying no to, not just what are we saying yes to. Once we have clarity and choices, that lets us ensure that we're allocating resources in a way that align with our plans. How do we budget our time? How do we budget our financial resources, other assets in service of the outcomes we want? And then all of that helps us prepare. What steps do we need to take in what order? What's the sequencing of things? What needs to be scaffolded over here to be able to do something over there? So if all of these things come out of a planning process, does this resonate? Does this kind of generally make sense? I feel like it lines up with what I saw in the chat. I want to go out on a limb and say, of these 4 things, the thing that I think is most important is the alignment piece. For those of you that have worked with me in a consulting context, you'll know that this is, oh, come on, Julia, we can click, right? There we go. That this is one of my very favorite quotes. Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, plans are everything. Planning is everything. And what I take that to mean is what comes of the planning process is what's valuable. The experience of planning is where we get value. The plan is kind of shit as soon as it hits the ground because our context changes. The ink has dried, the world is different, and now our plan needs to change. But the act of planning is where we create that alignment, where we see the world in the same way, where we deepen our understanding of each other's perspectives. We have that shared vision. And what I think is so important about that is when things do inevitably change and the thing that we planned for no longer is relevant, then we're so well aligned and we have that shared vision that it's easier to pivot a plan because we've done that really thoughtful planning work. And so what I love about this is the idea that it's the process that I think is the most important piece. Is the plan at the end important? Sure, absolutely. But something we need to hold lightly to because we know that as the context changes, the plan changes too. And so I think the alignment work is not just the most important part of the process, but as I said earlier, sometimes the hardest to achieve. The other nice thing about this is that, again, for those of you who lead teams, that alignment is also what drives effective decision-making, decisional autonomy, being able to push down power and decision-making, because if we're all aligned on where we're going, then it's easy for everybody to make decisions that move us in the same direction, even if it's not exactly what showed up on a plan. So just checking in, I saw some nodding there, but like, how does that land? As a type A planner, I have mixed feelings about this, but I'm mostly committed. And feel free to come off mic, or on mic. I'm seeing some thumbs up.
It's such a great point, Julia, because because so often decisions, or every time you make a decision, there's a trade-off to it. And I think that when you have, for example, like core values, it could be easier to kind of weigh what trade-offs we're willing to live with when you have that shared understanding. And I think it does help with morale as well and inclusion, and really helps make people feel like they're a part of the planning no matter what role they have.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And actually, even though I did not pay you for that, that is a lovely segue into my next slide. So when I introduced myself in the beginning, just going to Sarah's point, it all starts with should point back to a strong mission. Yes. So there's shared clarity on what is the ultimate thing we're rowing toward, and then is there alignment on the different pieces of how we're going to get there, and and to your point, Cassie, what trade-offs are we making along the way to get to that final point? So when I introduced myself at the beginning, I talked about the name of my business is People-Centered Change. I am really hyper-focused on how human beings experience organizational life. I think that is super important. I think it's more important in this moment than ever when our sector is under so much pressure and the people in our sector are under so much pressure. So I just want to take a quick segue and talk about exactly what Cassie just named, which is the human impact of really good planning as well. And so I have turned cognitive science into like a little bit of a hobby of mine, because I think that understanding the way our brains work really helps us understand the way that we show up in groups and why we behave the way we do and why we need the things that we do. And so I feel really strongly, as I've mentioned, about participatory processes, but also planning and alignment work, because in addition to creating organizational stability, it can also really create emotional stability, which is a big factor in creating resilience within the people in your organization as well as the organization as a whole. And we know that resilience is something that's really important in this moment. And so I want to talk a little bit about that before I get into the nuts and bolts. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that our brains really hate uncertainty. Our brain's whole job is to keep us safe. And the way that it keeps us safe is by putting a lot of effort into predicting what's going to happen so that it can come up with a plan for when that happens to keep us safe. That's basically where 90% of our brain's energy goes. The more uncertain things are, the more anxious and sort of worked up we can get because our brain isn't able to fulfill that function. And so if you're in an organizational system right now where folks are really anxious, where morale is really low, this could be why, because we're used to being able to predict the future to a certain degree, and we really can't right now. And so planning helps to feed that part of our brain that needs to know what's going to happen. We're telling ourselves, yeah, we have this plan. We're going to take these steps. The plan might change, but that's okay because we'll revisit it. So having a really good plan that everybody's on board with can really help to create clarity and calm and psychological safety, especially in moments where those things are hard to find. The other piece, and I think it was Cassie that you noted this at the beginning of the conversation, is that our brains also really like control. That's another way that we keep ourselves safe, is we control as much as we can about our environment. And what this means is if we're creating processes for our team where people have real, meaningful agency in driving the work that we do, in driving the work that we do individually, not only does it help us feel safer, less anxious, more steady, but it also helps us feel valued because our contribution, our expertise is being valued by the organization. The organization is saying, your perspective matters here, and so we want to plan with your perspective in mind. And so the process I'm laying out here, I designed with these two things in mind, that both were looking to create organizational stability, but also emotional stability for our team so that they can do their best work. And also helping folks bring their full agency and brilliance and ideas to the work and recognize the value of their work inside an organization. Make sense? I love talking about brain things. Happy to talk more about brain things, but I think that's a nice way to introduce. And Adrian, I'm seeing your comment. Once we have a shared vision as a group, everyone can respond more nimbly. I could not agree more because we've agreed on what matters. So then the steps kind of matter less. We can take this path and we can take that path because we've agreed, we know where we're going in the long term. So teeing up the stability planning conversation, in this context, I really see stability planning as being anchored in creating alignment around three key areas. What is the work at our core? What does stability mean to us? And that's going to be unique for every single organization. And what threatens stability? And so what I'm going to talk about next is a real kind of like blow by blow. How do we answer these questions for our organization so that we can come up with a plan that as much as we can creates the conditions for organizational stability? Let me pause there for a second, though. How's this landing? Folks have questions. How's my pacing? Too fast, too slow? I'm a good New Englander, so I can go real fast if you need me to.
It's great, Julia. Thank you so much. I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I know we've talked about this a little bit, you and I, but I think for the group benefit and conversation, can you touch on, what to do when maybe other people in your organization in positions of power don't necessarily share
For
the
example.
same the same understanding, right, of like human behavior and the need for greater communication and alignment? How do you build buy-in
Yeah.
around just that idea?
Yeah. I'll start by saying if I had fully solved that problem, I might have a house in whatever beautiful places in your background. Joking aside, though, I think there are lots of entry points to that conversation. You're hearing me come in with a very sort of like, I clearly have very strong values around this. I believe in creating the conditions for humans to thrive and succeed and feel whole and healthy and well in organizational systems, because I think that that is a good thing to do, a moral and ethical thing to do. And that is the way that I approach it. But that isn't the only entry point. And part of the reason I like to lean into the brain science and the cognitive science is that even if that is not your natural orientation, if you're not someone who really naturally pays attention to that in an organizational system, we know that these things happen anyway. So, for example, there's a lot of talk in the world of change management. If you've ever done change management work, you've probably heard someone talk about the idea of like resistors, that like when you're leading a change, you've got to watch out for like the resistors. And I always picture this as like the resistors, like they're meeting in the basement and they've got like the curly mustaches and they're like plotting the demise of your carefully planned change initiative. And the reality is that I think 9 times out of 10, people who are resisting change are probably just afraid about how that change is going to impact them, whether they're conscious of it or not. And so you can either plow over those people, in which case you're going to have pushback to the change. You're going to have folks who aren't really engaged, who don't see it as their responsibility, who aren't committed to it succeeding and will get in its way. Or you can recognize that there's a human experience happening here. And if we attend to that human experience, the functional work that we need to do is going to happen a lot more smoothly. And so I think what's important is recognizing that whatever entry point we have to this conversation, people are people, unless you're secretly leading an organization full of robots, which that day is coming real fast. And so if we don't create space to manage these kinds of experiences, if we don't attend to the human experience, it's going to come back at us in some way, whether it's resistance in a change process, whether it's loss in leadership trust, whether it's a really gossip-driven culture, whatever the outcome is, you will see an impact on your ability to deliver on your mission, your bottom line, however you define it. And so that was kind of long-winded, but I think that for me is the core, Cassie, is that whether it's a values proposition for us or not, it's still going to happen. It still matters if you care about being effective and if you care about meeting whatever good looks like for your organization.
Amazing. I'm so happy this is recorded because I'm going to come back to these words and I think you should write a book about it. That's all.
I appreciate that. Anything else? Any other reactions before we dive into like the nuts and bolts of this? Cool. Okay. So this next section is, like I said, intended to be really, my hope in this whole presentation is that this feels very practical. You'll see that the slides have a lot of content on them. My hope is that you can almost use it as like a workbook or a guide if you want to bring some of this work into your own organization. So for each, I'm going to talk about the overall process, and then I'm going to break down each individual stage in a more abstract way, and then in a more concrete way. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you 3 examples of what a whole start to finish process could look like. So like, how would you plug these pieces in together to build a whole process? And so hopefully by the end of this, you have a sense of like, what are the main pieces of work that need to be done? And what are some different ways that you could configure that work in a way that makes sense for your timeline, your organizational resources, all that kind of stuff. Make sense? Okay, cool. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that as a sector, and maybe as a country, but I'll stick with the sector right now because that's where my expertise is, there's a big push toward more. We do more. And sometimes it can feel like there's tension between being stable and doing more. So certainly funders can drive this experience of needing more, right? Funders prioritize new programming, not existing programming. They want to see you reach bigger targets, not the same targets you reached last year, right? So we're funded to do more. And I think as nonprofit people, we also do this to ourselves, right? Like we are super committed to the work that we do. We don't like seeing need that's not being met, especially in this moment where at least I feel like the need is greater than ever. It can be hard to say, no, we can't do more. We have to do what we're doing. And I have my own experience in supporting organizations where there's often a lot of pressure that's even put on leadership by staff. Hey, we want to do more. We want to explore over here. We want to explore over there. And so often leaders end up holding that tension of like, yes, we all want to do more. And if we can't do what we're doing now really well, we run the risk of not being able to do anything. And so I just want to acknowledge up front that the idea of stability over growth, and that doesn't always have to be a dichotomy, but in some moments it might be. And I think that's hard to grapple with, and it might be hard, might feel hard. And so I guess I just wanted to name that. Again, especially in this moment where I feel like the need is just greater and greater as the days go by. So kind of putting that aside for a moment, I also want to touch on what I think are some good principles to have in mind, or for your consideration when you think about planning with stability in mind. And the first is, I think in the context of creating stability, it's sometimes easy for our first choice or our first conversation to be, what can we cut? Where can we shave things off the budget? What can we eliminate? And I think there's a risk in those moments to trade short-term stability in this moment for long-term sustainability, our ability to do this work 5 years down the line. And I'm not saying that nonprofits in this moment don't have to be making hard decisions, that you don't have, there's no world in which you might have to cut a program or rethink your structure. Those are really very real choices that lots of organizations are making every single day. But I think approaching it through the lens of, am I sure that this is not going to hamstring us in the future? That this is not going to get in the way of us doing the work 5 years down the road that we really want to be doing? So how can we try to balance maintaining stability and not sacrificing the sustainability that we want to be able to hold on to? I don't think that's an easy thing, but I think it's something we can keep in mind. As much as possible, I think we want decisions to be data, community, and values driven. What are the actual needs in our community? What is the work that we are actually most effective at? And I'm going to unpack that in a minute. And who do we say that we are? And what actions are we taking that really live up to who we say that we are? In moments of systemic panic that we're in now, it might be easy to make snap decisions or gut decisions. And if we have the data, let's use it. Let's try to make decisions that we feel really confident about because we have good information. The perfectionist in me is dying, but I also want to say that this might be a moment to get comfortable with good enough. I think as a sector, we pursue perfection. We want to do the very best in all the ways for all the work that we do. And when we're in really difficult, really constrained contexts, good enough is probably good enough. And so learning how to recognize what good enough looks like and when we make that trade-off is really important too. Go ahead, Adrian.
Hi, I'm thinking about your second thing, and something that I've been wrestling with this week is the data. We had a I mean, I feel so bad for my staff because we did so much great like data organization and collection, and we just did a great job over the past 3 years of getting our data house in order. And now a lot of that data
Nice.
is relevant because of massive federal funding cuts to our field, to our
Yeah.
organization. And so a lot of the data that we collect is, irrelevant is not an overstatement. Like, it is actually no longer applicable because the entire network does not exist anymore. So I think it's like a little bit, I feel a tension around what we ground some of our decisions in.
Yeah.
And is it instinct? Is it the last conversation we had? I think our values are, that doesn't seem to be a tension, but there is this kind of, federal government just stopped collecting food insecurity data, for example. So it's like that data is no longer even exist, right?
Yep.
So I just kind of wanted to call out that for us, that this middle one seems to be our biggest challenge. I think we understand 1 and 3 really well, but we are struggling with some of the middle stuff.
Yeah, I really thank you so much for sharing that. Before sort of transitioning into consulting, I worked in public health for a long time. And I know that that's something that that sector is grappling with too, with all of the public health databases that have been taken offline. So that is so real right now. I think how I would answer that question, Adrian, and I will talk about this a lot in the next section of the presentation, is this is where I think having a really strong participatory process really shines. If you don't have like the solid numbers and the solid data in front of you that point you in a clear direction, I think there can be a lot of power in having a collaborative conversation that surfaces all the individual things we know and makes sense of them as a whole. That is a kind of data too, because everybody on your team knows different pieces of the picture. The people who you serve and the organizations who you partner with also hold different pieces of the picture. And so I think even if you can't rely on traditional data that you've had in the past, relying on a participatory process where you're really thoughtful about bringing in different vantage points can give you a really good way to ground decision, because you've got a lot of voices in the room that are helping to shape a direction that's going to make a lot of sense. And I'm going to get into that a lot when I break down the process. But how does that land?
Yeah, I agree. That's a great framing.
So last principle, and then I'll keep us rolling. So get comfortable with good enough, which like I have feelings about, but also let's be pragmatic here. And then of course, staying flexible and adaptive. This goes back to the idea that the plan is nothing. I really think that this is a moment for organizations to really lightly hold plans and outcomes, because there's so much that's happening that we don't have control over. And so I think a big part of this process for me is about getting clear on what are the hills that we're going to die on, that we're going to cling to, and what is the other stuff that we can be ready to let go when we need to stay focused on what's important. And so that means being really thoughtful about making decisions that commit you to a certain path for a certain number of years, or investing a big chunk of cash that you're not going to be able to get back. So how can we make sure that our decisions have wiggle room built in? So with those principles in place, the process is pretty straightforward. The first step is, and again, I'm going to break down each of these in a lot more detail, but the first step is really getting clear about what is at the core of what you need to be doing in this moment. What, based on your mission, is the work that you are protecting through a stability planning process. And then the next step is defining what is stability. I think that's going to be a really different answer for every organization, and depending on kind of where in your life cycle you are. And so getting clear about what does stability look and feel like to you. And then it's about identifying what puts that stability at risk. What are the internal and external factors that get in the way of us creating stability? And then finally, it's about setting, and what's important for me, I should have bolded this word too, is achievable priorities. What goals can we set for ourselves that will enable and nurture stability that we can really achieve? I'll say that I don't think this is a moment for setting wild, exciting, ambitious, sexy goals that we're not going to be able to achieve, because that feels really shitty when you miss the mark. And we don't need another reason to feel shitty right now. So I think setting really achievable goals is really important. Strategic optionality. I love that. Yes, strategic optionality. So I'm going to break down each of these again in a little bit more of an abstract way, and then hopefully in what feels like a really concrete way. And so that first step is, again, getting clear on your core. What is the work that you are protecting? What is the work that you want to hang on to? Which also means that you might be deciding what is the work that we cannot be hanging on to right now. And so when I think about the core, there are a couple things that come to mind for me. For those of you that have read Jim Collins' Good to Great, and then he has an addendum on sort of the social sector, he talks about this hedgehog concept, where the work that we should be doing, and I've adapted the language a little bit to better fit the nonprofit context, but he talks about the work that you should be doing should sit at the intersection of what is mission aligned, Where do you have the capacity to deliver real impact, and what's financially viable for you? And so what you should be doing in any given moment should check all three of those boxes. I think as organizations, we're often pursuing new things and exciting things and experimental things or hypothetical things that might someday sit in that core, but this might be a moment to decide, no, we're only doing things that check all of these boxes. And so again, in a moment of unprecedented uncertainty, being really focused about what you do helps you be clear about what you say and say yes and no to. Being clear about what you're prioritizing. Prioritization always means that there are some things that we're not doing. A good strategy should be clear about what you're saying no to. And so the outcome of getting clear on your core might be, hey, there are some things that we're going to pause or even sunset, or things that we're going to hand off to partners who do it just as well, or maybe even better than we do, because we really want to focus our energy on these things that matter the most for us. And then I think someone flagged this earlier in the process. Once you're really clear on what your core is, you're well set up to move quickly when opportunities that are aligned with your core come up. So if you're clear that these are the three populations we're prioritizing, or these are the three programs or kinds of activities or outcomes or whatever it is, when there's a partnership opportunity or a funding opportunity that aligns well with that, it is so easy to say yes. It's so easy to jump right in because you've already made the decision that that's a yes. And it's also really easy to say no to things and not let them bog you down or become a distraction. That makes sense so far? And then I can talk a little bit about the how here. Cool. So from a process standpoint, how might you do this? So on the left here, I've got some questions that you can be asking of yourself and potentially of your community, constituents, partners, to help you understand what is your core right now. So what is the work that we do that we're most effective at? Where do we create the most mission impact? Where is our work most unique, where nobody else is doing it? And if we stopped, the work would stop. Versus what are we doing that maybe somebody else is doing? And again, maybe even better than we do it. What is the work that is most needed in this very unique moment? What work do we actually already have the capacity to do today? The finances, the systems, the skills, what can we already do? And thinking about the financial viability piece, what's the work that we can actually get funded to do, or that we have funding, or that we can pursue funding? And so getting clear on your core is about answering those questions for yourself. And so here's one way that you could go about doing that. You can start by, if you have data that is viable, and Adrian, I hear you that for a lot of us that might not be true right now, but let's look at the data we do have access to. Look at program performance, outcomes, impact, participation, whatever we track. Do we have a clear sense of where are we really hitting the level of impact we want to hit? Where are we seeing real demand for whatever we put out into the world? Next up is also thinking about how do we center the voices of whoever it is that we're serving in a given moment, our community, constituents, participants, clients, customers, whatever word that we're using. How do we make sure that we're making choices that actually reflect what they're telling us that we need? And so depending on how robust of a process you want to do, on the one hand, this might be, hey, we've got an existing database of program feedback. Let's review that through the lens of stability planning and see what there is for us to learn. The other end of the spectrum that's more robust might be, let's have some conversations. Let's do some focus groups. Let's do some interviews. Let's have a town hall. Let's do a survey. Let's ask people what they most value from us in this moment, what they most need from us in this moment. And then I think this goes back to my response to you, Adrian, is how do we also leverage all of the really smart, dedicated folks that we have inside our organizations? Different people in your organization are going to see the answers to these questions in really different ways. And this process is really designed to maximize that. So you might also want to ask your whole staff, maybe team by team, or maybe in an all staff, How do we think about the most important aspects of our work? Maybe this is a retreat that you do. Maybe there's a cross-organizational committee where you've got representation from each of your teams where you have this conversation. But how do you harvest from across your organization a shared vision of what's most important? And you can feed that conversation with constituent data, and you can feed that conversation with programmatic data. But the goal is to be able to walk away from this step of the process and say, these are the 2 or 3 things that we are going to really center in our work for the next 6 months or a year or whatever it is. And that means that we're going to deprioritize these things, and we're going to put this thing over here to the side for at least a year and see where things land. So we're clear on what we are prioritizing and what that means in terms of what we're not prioritizing. Pausing there to see how that lands and if that's all making sense so far. Any questions? Cool so far? Okay. I always worry about the lack of questions because it's like either I'm just being so clear that like, it's like I'm beaming it directly into your brain, or I'm speaking Greek and you don't even know where to begin to ask questions because you've got no foundation to know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to assume that it's the clarity part. So that's step 1, is that clarity on your core. The next step is about defining stability. What does stability mean for your organization? And the first step is recognizing that even within one organization, defining stability is going to look different for different parts of your organization. So when you think about stability for your finance team, finance might be like, yeah, stability is easy. Money in equals money out. And we have credit for when things get wobbly. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thanks. Just thinking back on the slide that you just shared, as organization leaders, what are your thoughts or recommendations on how do we get all of that good input, but not make it this like enormous can of worms that then as the leaders, we have to say no to a lot of things, right? Because we don't necessarily have the capacity or resources, or team members at different positions in the organization don't understand what it takes to execute on something.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. I touch on this a little bit later in the presentation, but I think one of the things that I think about a lot, no worries, Sarah, and we're also recording, so we'll be sending the slides out after and you can catch up on what you missed. I used to have a boss who used to say, and I stole it because it's so good, disappointment equals expectations minus reality. And the way that I make sense of that is the more we can be clear with people up front about what they can expect from a process, what it's going to look like, how it's going to feel, what it's going to result in, what your role is going to be, what you can and can't do in this process. The more explicit we can be about those things up front, the less frustration there is on the back end when people might have expected one thing and now they're getting something else. And so, Sarah, to your point, that might be framing the process with, here's what we're hoping to do. We're hoping to pick 2 things that we can focus on. That means we're going to have to say no to some things, but that's the direction we're going in. So our goal is to really get excited about the 2 most important things, recognizing that we can't do everything right now. It might mean getting really clear upfront about how we make decisions. Are we making decisions in a really collaborative way? Are we informing 2 or 3 people who are going to hold the decision-making authority? How do decisions get communicated? The more we can be explicit about what people can expect up front, it doesn't mean that they're going to love it, but they're not going to experience that disappointment of, oh, you've built up my expectations and now this is not what I thought it was going to be and I'm annoyed. Does that get it? Some of what you're asking, Sarah?
Yeah. Yes, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So getting back to defining stability, this is going to look different from the different functional areas in your organization. For finance, again, it might be cash in equals cash out, and we've got credit for emergencies. For folks that are doing programmatic work, it might mean we want to maintain a certain level of reach in terms of number of people, or it might mean there's a handful of specific communities that we want to sustain a presence in. It's going to look different. For HR, it might be, hey, stability means that people make decisions more quickly and smoothly. So we've got some big bottlenecks that we need to work on. Or it might be retention, or it might be onboarding, but it's going to look different. And so part of defining stability, our goal here is about answering the question of stability for who and for what. Stability of staff experience, stability of constituent outcomes, stability of operational effectiveness, all of those things, reputational stability as we navigate difficult decisions. And so the purpose here is to really get clear on what kind of stability are we creating and who do we want to experience that stability. My own 2 cents is ideally it's both a mix of the people and communities and the outcomes that we serve and the people inside our systems who are our organization who are also experiencing tremendous instability right now. And so again, a little bit on how you might approach that. Starting again with some key questions for how you can build that shared definition. Talking to different aspects of your organization, asking, what does stability mean from the perspective of your work? What about sustainability? Are those 2 things different or similar for you? If we were to prioritize stability over growth, what would that change about your priorities today? What would you start doing or stop doing? Where do we have the most control internally around creating stability? What are the resources and supports you would need to drive stability? And so if our goal here, if we want to sort of answer these questions as a way to define stability, what I would suggest here is first looking at the functional level. So how do we understand stability from a team perspective, from finance, from HR, from programs, from ops, from leadership? And so you might have individual team conversations about these questions. You might have one-on-one conversations with organizational leaders. You might do an all-staff survey where you have people let you know what team they're on, where the goal is to really understand from those different functional standpoints, what does stability look like? And then bringing people together. Again, this idea of triangulating and bringing shared perspective to define what does stability mean for all of us. And it might mean that there's aspects of stability that come from the different elements of our organization, but together it means this from a financial standpoint, this from a programmatic standpoint, this from a people and ops standpoint. And so the idea here is you want to build that together. So if we're creating stability for the next 6 months or the next year, what are we building toward that? So that's coming up with that stability definition. I want to pause here again and see if folks have questions or reactions. Okay. So the next piece is, okay, if we've identified what stability looks like to us, what's going to get in the way of that? What risks or threats might prevent us from creating stability insofar as we can? I think it's important to define both, and I'll define what I mean by both in a second. And I think at this step, it's also really important to be clear on where you do and don't have control. I think one of the things that is so challenging about this moment is there's so much that's happening that we don't have control over. And so our question is like, are we just reacting? Or there are places where we can buffer ourselves or insulate ourselves from some of what's happening outside our organizations. So just to define terms, I would say a risk is something is more of an internal concern. It's where we think that something that we're doing has the potential to not go the way we wanted. So we might say, oh, well, this program runs the risk of not achieving its goals because we're testing a bunch of new approaches here, and some of them might not work out the way we had wanted them to. So there's some risk there. So that's something we have a lot of control over because we're deciding what we do and don't do, and we're deciding to experiment with some new tools or some new approaches or whatever these hypothetical people are doing. A threat is something that happens outside of our organization, an external event or actor that does something that then lands on us. So an example of this might be like, hey, our main funder, they're thinking about pivoting away from the area of work that we do that they fund right now. And so if they do that, we have no control over that choice, or we have very little control over that choice, but it's going to have a big impact on us. And so this step is really about identifying both of these things. What are the internal risks and the external threats that we want to be ready to mitigate and manage, again, so that we can create this little bubble of stability for our team, for our constituents, for our communities. And so for the how for this, again, we've got some key questions here. So what are the current risks or threats to stability that you see? And again, thinking about this from a functional standpoint, what do you see as emerging risks or threats? What's coming down the pipe that you're starting to see some inklings of? Where do you see as the most important opportunities to mitigate risks and protect ourselves from threats? Are there things that we could be doing that we're not doing? And then, are there things we're doing today that might negatively impact stability? Are there things we're experimenting with? Or are there places where we're stretching ourselves? Or is there something we're doing that we're putting a ton of time and energy and resources into that doesn't actually land in our core, that's pulling us away from creating stability for the core? And so again, asking these questions from different functional teams. How do you relate this to a SWOT analysis? I think we're asking a lot of similar kinds of questions. I like the idea of identifying risks as well as threats, because we often have a lot more control over risk mitigation than truly managing threats, especially at the scale that we're facing now. And I think for me, a lot of stability planning is about making choices where we have control, where we can make decisions that actually impact our own outcomes or our own experiences. Certainly, if you were doing this as part of a more robust process, if it feels like doing more of a SWOT orientation where you're talking about strengths and opportunities as part of your core, I think that can make a lot of sense too. Should decide between a strategic plan or a stability plan, or is there a way to do both at the same time? So I came up with this process because I was working with a client who was like due for a strategic plan, but the sector that they're in, let's say they're in reproductive health, and it's very complicated in that world right now. And so for them, the idea of truly strategic planning just felt like impossible. Like, you want us to plan 3 years out, really? And so we came up with this as a way to stabilize some really challenging stuff that was happening in the organization as a result of this external context. So I think for a lot of organizations, this might be a helpful interim thing to do if you're thinking about strategic planning, but you're like, absolutely not under these circumstances. I could also imagine a world where you still think you want to think about that longer term trajectory, but you want to bring a flavor of stability into it. And so I think you could bring some of these prompts and the participatory nature of this work easily into a strategic planning process to get those kinds of outcomes as well. So I think it depends on, like, where are you, how on fire are things, and what feels most important in this work. And if you're like, we just need to like batten down the hatches, I think this is a really helpful approach. I'm mixing a lot of metaphors. I hope that's okay. On fire, exactly. On a scale of 1 to, I don't know, that dog in that meme. So in terms of answering these questions, I think from a process standpoint, you can actually be doing step 3 and step 2 at the same time. So if you're having conversations with functional teams about what stability means, in that same conversation, you can also be asking, and what's going to get in the way of that? What are the threats and risks that you see? If that's what stability looks like, what's going to get in the way of that? So you can actually kind of merge these 2 steps, and I'll show you what that looks like functionally in the next section of the presentation. But again, it's just about surfacing from different vantage points, what does this mean to you? And then pulling that together into a shared holistic definition that makes sense for your whole organization. I'll also pause at this moment and say, the risks and threats conversation is tricky because it can be very easy to stay in this conversation and really spin through all the things that are really hard right now. That said, one of the things that I really liked about this process and the experience I've had with this with clients is how unexpectedly optimistic it is, because in doing this, the goal is to focus on the things we can control. And I don't know about you, but I feel like this is a moment where it feels like there's a lot of things that we can't control. And as I mentioned earlier, our brains do not like that whatsoever. And so by giving ourselves a direction where we do have control, where we can have impact, recognizing there are things that we can do, even when things are really hard, can feel actually really optimistic and really energizing. So I think as long as we're sort of maintaining good conversational boundaries so that the risks and threats conversation doesn't become a black hole, this whole process can have a really optimistic and almost empowering kind of experience for folks. So last step is about deciding what you're going to do. What priorities do we want to set? And this is going to look really different for different kinds of organizations and depending on how the rest of your process goes. But I'm going to lay out a couple different things that you can be thinking about that will inform how you do this. So by the time you've reached this step, you've answered 3 questions. What is the work we should be doing right now? What does stability mean for us, our constituents, our staff, our operations? What do we see as risks and threats? And so now our work is to bring all those answers together and decide, okay, what do we do about what we've just learned? And so I mentioned this before, but I think it's really important to set achievable priorities in this moment. I think there are moments for big, bold, blue sky thinking. I think this might not be that moment. I think we want to set goals that we can achieve and celebrate and build momentum around. Going back to my intro, this is the part where we really have to remember that the plan itself is nothing. So we're going to set some priorities, we're going to set some goals, but we want to hold them lightly, recognizing that something big might happen tomorrow that's really going to change how we think about things. And then finally, I think this is another place where good enough matters. We want to set goals that are good goals that we would be proud to achieve, but that are good enough, that aren't stretch goals, that aren't like, oh, if we did this, we'd be working ourselves out of business. That might not be the place we're in right now, and that's okay. And so you could kind of think about this answering this question, doing this priorities work in these kind of 3 clusters, starting with what work are we prioritizing? And again, this is what you're going to be surfacing through the previous 3 steps. So where are we doubling down? What are we stepping away from? What does this look like in the context of prioritizing stability? How does that impact resources? How are we accounting for risks and threats? Then we can answer the question, well, what does this mean in terms of investment internally? Are there policies, procedures, and systems that we need to make sure are in place? Is there support that our staff are going to need to really thrive as best we can in a really challenging moment? If we're going to double down on these programs over here, does that mean that we need to send more resources that way? And then are there additional resources that we need? What does this mean for how we think about our revenue model or our fundraising work or development or whatever that looks like? Again, recognizing that that's a rapidly changing environment for anybody who has access to federal grants. So as you think about what you prioritize, you can use, I have some questions here that you can use as a little bit of a prioritization rubric. And if you like a good 2x2 grid, I know us consultants get a lot of shit for liking 2x2 grids, but it's because they're great. You could even plug some of these into a 2x2 grid, right? Thanks for joining, Melissa. I'll circulate the rest of the presentation after. So the first is stability versus sustainability. Where are we at least not hurting long-term sustainability? Managing risks and threats. Where do we have the most internal control? Where we can do things that we're pretty confident are going to provide that buffer for us. Where can we draw on data to make good decisions that we're really confident in? Where we have data, where that's possible. Where can we make choices that feel really aligned with our values and how we want to show up in the world, even in difficult moments? And then what choices can we make that will help us stay flexible versus what might lock us into a commitment that might not make sense 6 months or 6 weeks from now. And so you can use these prompts as a way to kind of sift through what are really the goals that we want to set for ourselves in this moment. So I want to pause here, and I realize that I accidentally hid this slide. So I'm just going to find it real quick and unhide it. And give us a chance to chat a little bit. And then I'm going to I'll show you some examples of what it could look like to actually put all these pieces together and implement something. So this is just a space to I just talked for 35 minutes, which nobody likes. So somebody stop me. Adrian, go ahead.
I think we all enjoyed you talking for 35 minutes, Julia. It was
Hooray.
clear. I think the thing that we're in the middle of right now is we use Clifton strengths within the organization and have a very asset-based kind of focus to everything that we do. And so I think that the other thing I would put in here alongside all these steps is kind of looking at what assets your team has from a personality standpoint, and how those assets could be leveraged as part of the stability conversation. Because I think that even when I'm in small groups with different leaders within my organization, the conversation takes very different turns. And people don't, and I think I think what really was great for me to hear was you need to develop a shared definition of stability to kind of move forward. And so I was thinking, okay, for our retreat, let's use appreciative inquiry to create a shared vision of sustainability.
Nice.
And I do think that it's worthwhile to also really sit down and say, when we make organizations or decisions well as an organization, even in times of stability, what do we know about ourselves that then we can bring into this new environment? Because I'm just shocked at how different groups of my staff see this issue incredibly differently in different teams, right?
Yeah.
Teams are really different. So I know that's the only thing I was thinking I would sort of add as a slide for Leah's Pantry, because we have a pretty good background of our strengths.
I love so much of what you just said, Adrian, and just to touch base on the last thing you said about how differently your teams see this. For me, that is the most exciting thing about a process like this, is there are so many different ways to answer these questions that by asking a broad swath of the organization, we get such a more robust, resilient, sticky solution, if that makes sense, because it's bringing in all those vantage points. I love your suggestion around sort of an asset-based orientation and bringing in that appreciative inquiry lens. One of the things I love about appreciative inquiry, going back to sort of my interest in cognitive science, there is such a psychological difference in the outcome of a conversation that starts from an asset-based place of what does it look like when we kill it? What does it look like when we're doing our best? What does it look like when we're really living up to our mission and values? The flavor of that conversation is radically different. And it doesn't mean you don't have you still ask the hard questions, you still talk about the hard things, but starting with the orientation of where are we at our best and how do we do more of that versus how do we solve all these problems we're drowning in is a fundamentally different conversation. And again, a much more optimistic conversation, a more agency-driven conversation, and it's still real. We're not sugarcoating things. But I love that suggestion. And certainly if you're an organization that already has that really strong asset-based culture, I think that's so exciting. Other questions or reactions at this point? So maybe what I'll do is I'll show the last couple of slides, which are hopefully the most practical in terms of thinking about how to string all this together. And then we should have some time for some chat, discussion, Q&A, whatever feels most helpful. So just some examples of what this could look like. And I mentioned this earlier, but just to start, I want to talk a little bit about decision making. I think in any participatory process, it is really important to be super clear on how decisions are being made and by whom. And this kind of goes back to that idea that the better that we can set people's expectations, the better that they're able to exist in the context of those expectations. And again, it's not about promising people that they're going to get exactly what they want. It's about letting people know what they can expect so that they can get comfortable with that outcome. And so decision making is a key place for that. You want to be clear upfront as we launch into this process. How are decisions being made? By whom? With what information? And how will you know once a decision is made? That last point is also really key, going back to what we talked about in the beginning in terms of certainty, our brains not liking ambiguity. By telling people, hey, when a decision is made, you'll be informed. Here's how, here's when. We're creating that expectation of information being shared, which helps to create that stability, even in the context of ambiguity. So that's something I feel very strongly about. So 3 quick sort of scenarios on what this could look like at different kind of resource points. This first scenario is, okay, let's imagine you've got a couple weeks and you want to do a 1-day retreat where you have as many of these conversations as you can. This is sort of a minimal resource investment. You might have 1 or 2 people who are planning this, capturing outputs at the end, and then you've got 1 full day from all of your staff. And so you might prepare ahead by gathering whatever data you want to work with in the room. Define, maybe you can't answer all of the questions I've shared in the PowerPoint. Maybe there are 3 or 4 or 5 that really feel relevant in this moment that you want to work with. And one of my shortcuts when I want to make the most of a short session or not a lot of time is, rather than brainstorming in the room, I'll do a survey ahead of time, let people brainstorm on the survey. Then we present the survey findings in the room and we build off of that. And we sense make that together and we add new ideas. So we're not starting from scratch. So you could do a quick staff survey. And then here's an example of what a session could look like. If you have a 1-day retreat, you might spend the morning getting really clear on what is our core, what is that, what are the assets that we bring, what is the work that's most important for us to be doing in this moment, and then what does stability look like for us? Maybe we've got some survey feedback from our different teams that we work through together, and then we come together with a shared and create a shared definition. And we're talking about stability, risks, and threats all in that same conversation. Then you might break for lunch and then come back in the afternoon and say, okay, we know what's most important. We know what stability looks like and what's going to get in our way. What does that mean in terms of how we set goals for the next period of time? And so if you've got like not a lot of time and resources, but this feels like something that would be helpful to do, that's what that could look like. Now, let's say you've got a little bit more time and a little bit more resources. You might do like more of a working group sprint type experience where you've got 2 or 3 months. Maybe you've got a cross-functional working group that can really hold some substantive work. And so you would start by who is in that group. And because this process relies so heavily on diversity of perspective, really being intentional about creating a really diverse working group. And I've got some examples there of how you could think about diversity. Have that group go through the process of clarifying what is your core work. So maybe they're talking with constituents, or they're surfacing existing constituent data that you've got. They're having a conversation. Maybe they're validating that conversation through engagement with other teams or other leaders. They might work with each individual functional team to surface, okay, from your team, what does stability mean? What are the risks and threats that you see? And kind of pull all that data together. And then still have an all staff day. I think it's really important in a planning process like this to have one moment where everybody is in the room together. But that last day might be the working group saying, okay, here's what we heard from you in terms of what is stability, What are the risks? What's our core work? Let's validate that together. Let's kind of get the kinks out of that. And then together we decide what do we want to do based on that information. And so you're doing that prioritization and planning and goal setting work together. Last but not least, if you've got time, like let's say you're doing this instead of strategic planning and you had set aside the time and resources to do the whole strategic planning dog and pony show, this is the most robust process. And so this could be 4 to 6 months, as many as 9 months. This is a bigger time investment for your organization. This is a place where you're really going to be engaging with constituents. You might want to think about constituent compensation there. You're doing a couple staff retreats. But this is a different kind of process where, again, you still have a working group that's kind of holding the frame, but you're doing really thorough constituent engagement. You're working to do an internal review of whatever data you've got. And then you have 2 staff workshops where the first would be, hey, based on what we heard from our constituents in our programmatic data, team, what is our core work? What is the work we want to be focusing on? And you spend a whole day having that conversation and getting really clear together about what that means. Then you have the working group go off and do that team by team engagement. What does stability mean? What are the risks and threats? Asking that of everybody, pulling that all together. And then you have a second staff workshop where you say, okay, here's what we heard about the definition of stability. Did we get this right? Let's work on that. And then what does that mean for what we do next? What does that mean for our goals? How are we going to carry this work out of the room? So obviously, nothing is written in stone. You can kind of mix and match elements from these, but hopefully these give you a sense of like, how do these pieces of work, how could they fit together in different kinds of configurations? So I will pause again there, and I can leave this up on the screen, but I just want to, again, give a chance for questions, reactions, ideas. What's coming up for you?
Hey, Julia, I've been a little reluctant to talk because I came in late, so I might have missed stuff.
You're allowed.
I missed stuff, but I guess my question really is, so our organization had gone through like a mini strategic planning around our programs like 2 years ago, and then we worked with a group to do strategic planning last year, and for 4 to 6 months, and now we're talking about possibly doing some work with a pro bono group, Inspire, to look like forward about certain programs or ways to expand. And I guess I'm wondering, how does this all fit into your what you're talking about today, like with these different larger processes that are happening? Like, I heard this last slide is like in place of a strategic plan. So I'm just curious from a higher, like, bird's eye view, how you see this interacting with these different strategic planning processes.
Yeah. So I think for me, it depends on what feels most important to your organization in this moment. The way that this work came together for me is I had a client who needed to do strategic planning, like was due for a strategic plan, but because of their particular sector and context, was just like, we can't think a year in the future, never mind 3 to 5 years. Like, that's just, there's too much changing. Things are chaotic. We need something different that's going to give us some space to breathe. And so for them, the most important thing was, how do we create some stability so that people can just do their jobs, feel really good about their jobs, feel really good about their impact, even though we operate in a sector that is really hostile right now. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum are organizations where, for a whole host of reasons, this might not feel relevant, and that's okay. I think there are also lots of places in the middle where, if you're doing other kinds of strategy work or planning work, recognizing the dynamics of the sector right now, that you might want to be asking questions about stability alongside questions about other kinds of strategic goals. So you might be saying, hey, we know we need to grow in this direction because that's really where the need is right now, and we can see that that's where the need is going to be for the next few years. is there anything we need to stabilize or even shrink a little bit so that we have the capacity to really focus on something new or a risk we want to take or something that we want to test over here? So I think it's about gauging how much is this a priority for your organization in this moment. If things really are feeling chaotic and on fire and everything's a catastrophe and people are really worn down and exhausted, then prioritizing stability and giving people a chance to catch their breath might be the thing to do, even if it's just for the next 6 months. And then you can revisit in 6 months. How are we feeling? Do we feel like there's room for us to focus on something else? Yes or no? I don't know if that gets to your, did that get to your question, Sarah?
Yeah, it did, Julia. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, no problem. What else is coming up for folks?
I can jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Other Sarah. So, something I've been thinking about through this presentation is we have been, like, our leadership team has been leaning into sort of over communicating during this chaotic time. And, we do receive a lot of federal funding, and that's been a roller coaster. And so, there'll be something in the headlines and maybe people are anxious unnecessarily or something. So we try to sort of nip that in the bud where we can.
Nice.
But it's also, so I think we've been doing a good job with that. But I think it's also, the presentation has prompted me to think about, like, what can we be doing to kind of get some of the more junior folks, like, more involved, or just, just taking maybe like ownership a little bit more over the direction of the work.
Yeah. In hearing you talk, that my head's going in a bunch of different places, but I think one of the things that is not unique about our sector, but more prevalent in our sector, are the ways that our identities become entangled with our work. So if we're doing mission-driven work, my experience is it's much more likely that our identity is really connected with that work. And so our work brings us meaning in a way that's really important to us as human beings, right? And we bring all this creativity and problem-solving energy and capacity and everything to this work. The more that we're able to really show agency, the more that we're able to demonstrate ownership, the more that we're able to really demonstrate value and feel valued in return and feel the trust that comes with being given work that matters to do, all both helps us feel more whole and healthy inside and gives us more resilience to battle the next federal funding cut or whatever it is, right? So I think that really resonates, Sarah, that especially for folks that are newer to the sector and maybe don't have a lot of authority in their day-to-day work, it might be really healthy to think about how can we give folks an appropriate level of authority so that they can really dig in and have that ownership and see the impact of their work at a time when I think we're all looking for opportunities to create impact.
Right. And part of that might be like a little bit less of buffering them from all of the difficult stuff that management's like slogging through these days.
Yeah. I think one of the traps that we fall into as leaders, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, Sarah, but I've been talking about this a lot. I think sometimes our instinct is to protect people, to say, oh, we don't want to share too much. We don't want to make people anxious. We don't want to scare people. And I know that that comes from a place, for the most part, of real care. I want to take care of the people on my team. And I think, especially in a moment like this, I don't think we're actually protecting people from anything. They know what's going on, right? It's too big to not know. And they're talking about it. And in the absence of official information from our leaders, our brains fill in the gaps. We need to understand what's happening. And if we don't have facts, we'll just kind of fill that in with our own facts because we need to understand the story. And 9 times out of 10, when we do that, we fill in the gaps in the absence of official information. We almost do it in ways that are worse than the reality. it's almost always more doom and gloom. It's almost always more alarming or extreme. And so I think for the most part, even when we're trying to protect people, often by not being over communicative the way you're describing, we're actually heightening anxiety, and people are gossiping and spinning around like, oh, why aren't we talking about this? Why don't we know? And so I really do think this is the moment to over communicate and recognize that your team are all grown-ups and they can handle the information, and they need to be able to make, thoughtful decisions about their own lives. And if their risk threshold is different than your organization's risk threshold, they might need to make a decision about that, and they have the right to do that. So I think it's a tough tension, I think, to hold, but it sounds like you're doing a lot of that over communication work, and I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other last questions, reactions, thoughts, dreams? Aside from very much enjoying Sarah's dog? Cool. Well, I'll say it has been really lovely getting to spend a little bit of time with all of you, despite the challenging moment that we all find ourselves in. I hope this felt helpful. After the call, I will share the recording. I'll share a PDF of the slides, so you'll have those too. And I've got a QR code on the screen. I'll include it in my follow-up email. I would love your feedback. My goal is to be offering content like this at least on a monthly basis. My work is in strategy and organizational transformation, and I'm trying to be responsive to this very weird moment we're all in together. And so if there are things that you're grappling with where you're like, I'd really like to be in a room with other nonprofit people to talk about this, let me know on the survey. There's also a way on the survey to stay in touch so that if I do more stuff, I'll let you know, which might be relevant for you or people in your nonprofit lives. Thanks, Emma. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for being here, folks. Feel free to stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, yeah, stay tuned. I'll get you all the materials by the end of the day today. And I can turn off the recording now. Right? There we go.